How's it going, everybody? Going to be discussing some budget commanders for each color. Most of these are under $1, but a couple of them are $2 to $3. Let's start off with the green creatures. I still think Rishgar is probably the best budget commander for green. It's only 3 mana, so it gets out really early. It can also put counters on 2 of our creatures, and each creature that does have a counter on it's going to be able to tap for mana. This pretty much just works well in all green strategies. It's going to allow you to ramp into your bigger plays and really whatever you want to do. If you really want to play mono green and you don't know exactly what your commander should be, I think this is a pretty obvious choice. It just fits so well with what green wants to do. Next up is Yeva. Don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but she's a 4 mana 4/4 with flash. It's also going to give all of our green creature spells flash. This is fun because it adds a whole different element to the game. Flashing in something like Moss Viper during our opponent's combat phase could be pretty funny. Giving all of our creature spells flash just opens up a lot of different outlets that weren't there before. Moving on is Titania. I actually really like this card and I'm adding it to my buy list right now. Whenever she enters the battlefield, we're going to take a land and put it onto the battlefield from our graveyard. Whenever a land we control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, we're going to make a 5/3 token. This works well with cards like Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse. Also, some lands are in the graveyard, such as Cycle lands or even creature lands. We're going to be able to return them back to the battlefield. This card does work a lot better with the more expensive lands. However, there still are some pretty good budget options. Moving on to some red cards. We already did a deck tech of Zada, but this card is stupid fun. The cards that you typically want to play in this deck are really cheap creatures that summon tokens, as well as really cheap pump spells. You really want to create a big wide board, then pump up Zada with one of the spells, then you're able to copy it to each other creature. So if you play cards like Goblin Rabblemaster or Young Pyromancer, you're going to be able to create a lot of tokens. Then if you have Zada on the field, you're going to cast something like Brute Force, and you're going to give everything +3/+3 to the end of the turn. The surprise factor in this deck is what makes it super fun. Next up is Torbrand. If red source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it's going to deal that much damage +2 instead. So kind of similar to Zada, we're going to be playing some really cheap creatures. But in this deck, we're going to be playing a lot of cheap burn spells too. Devil tokens are probably one of the best things we can summon in this deck. Devil tokens are 1/1s, but when they die, we're going to deal 1 damage. So every time this devil attacks, it's actually going to deal 3 damage instead. And when it does die, we're going to deal 3 damage to any target. So a dumb little 1/1 token actually has a lot of value. Then if you play something like Thermal Alchemist, it's a defender, but every time you tap it, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. But technically it's going to be dealing 3 when you have Torbrand on the field, or Torbrand on the field. And the Chain Whirler is cool too, because when it enters the battlefield, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent, each creature, and planeswalker they control. So it's actually going to be dealing 3 damage to everything. This card seems like a lot of fun, and I got to build a deck with it soon. The last card for red is going to be Urbrass the Hidden. I really love the Phyrexian monsters as well as the art on this card. This is going to give creatures we control have haste, and creatures our opponents control are going to enter the battlefield tapped. This is just a pretty well-rounded card. I wouldn't say it really fits in with any specific strategy. However, if I had to build around it, I would want to play really big creatures that do things when they attack. So something like the Spinosaurus or Inferno Titan, whenever they attack, they're going to do something spicy. That's kind of how I would build this. Moving on to some black cards, we have Shirei. Whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, we're going to return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step, as long as this card is still on the field. This card opens up a lot of sacrificing combos and strategies, because we're going to be triggering enter the battlefield effects as well as dying effects. I think it's also really versatile too. We can run cards like the Zealot whenever it enters the battlefield. We're going to be able to draw a card, and then we can sacrifice it using something like Viscera Seer to continually get card draw. And if we play cards like the Carrion Feeder, we can continually sacrifice creatures and they're going to get returned back to the battlefield. So we're just able to get a lot of value by playing these really cheap creatures. There's definitely so much you could do with a card like this. I will be working on a deck tech in the near future with this card. Next up is a Black Vampire Drana. She's a 3 mana 2/3 with flying and first strike. Whenever she deals combat damage to a player, we're going to put a counter on each attacking creature we control, including this card. This is just a fun creature that's not only going to grow in size, but it's going to grow our entire board. We can get it out pretty early too because it's only 3 mana. And there's also a lot of good vampire strategies you can do with this. So if you play something like this other vampire, whenever this card or another creature dies, we're going to put a +1 counter on each vampire we control, so we can continually grow our vampires even more. If I had to build this deck, I would run more artifacts like Swiftfoot Boots or something like Fire Shrieker. Just give it hexproof and haste, or better yet, we're going to give it double strike. This card does state whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it's going to trigger the ability. So by giving it double strike, we're actually going to be able to trigger this twice, which is pretty fun. Next up is Gonti, Lord of Luxury. Whenever this card enters the battlefield, we're going to look at the top 4 cards of our opponent's library and exile one of them face down. And as long as this card remains exiled, we can actually cast it by paying any mana. This is fun because we're getting a free spell out of it. We're potentially disrupting our opponent. I think this card works well with really any black deck because of the value it brings. If I had to build this card, what I would mainly do is I'd run things like Supernatural Stamina, Undying Evil, or Feign Death. If this card does die, we're actually going to bring it back to the battlefield for 1 mana, and we're going to trigger that ability again. So if I had to build around it, that's what I would do. Moving on to some blue creatures, we actually did a deck tech on Talrad already. I really like this card. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we're going to create a 2/2 flying Drake. This pairs really well with cheap instances and sorcery spells. The deck that we built plays a lot of cheap counter spells and draw. So what we're able to do is generate a lot of tempo swings by countering our opponent and creating a token for them to deal with. These tokens do have flying, so if your opponent doesn't have reach or creatures with flying or removal, it's a pretty big problem. This card is also a merfolk, so you can go down that strategy. We play things like Opt for card draw and Vapor Snag just for cheap removal, and then stuff like Counterspell just to obviously counter our opponent. The next creature is this god, I don't know how to pronounce that. It's a 5/5 flying indestructible with only 3 mana. However, it can't attack or block unless we have 7 or more cards in our hand. However, for 4 mana we can return a land we control back to our hand and we can draw a card. We can easily get more than 7 cards in our hand by playing cards like this or the Primal Tide. Don't actually know how to pronounce that first card. It's going to make our maximum hand size unlimited, and we're also going to be drawing a lot of cards. We can also return lands back from our hand, which at first doesn't seem that good, but it actually is. If we play something like Mystic Sanctuary, every time this card enters the battlefield, we're going to put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of our library. So essentially we can be recurring stuff back from our graveyard. There's a lot of lands that have these enter the battlefield effects where this card can take advantage of that. I think this card can pair well on most blue decks. You just have to run some extra lands as well as some cards that are going to increase your hand size to get the full benefit of the creature aspect. Moving on to the next creature, I don't understand how this is a card, but it's a 4 mana 0/17, and if an opponent tries to target this card, they have to spend 2 extra mana to cast it. Also, we can pay 3 mana and make this thing huge. This is just one of the dumbest cards I've seen. I don't understand how it was really printed, but blue kind of wants to sometimes stall the game out, and this is what this card does. This is just a hard card for opponents to deal with, as well as if they have a creature-based strategy. It's going to be hard for them to get around. If you're looking for a card to stall the game, this is the card for you. Moving on to some white cards, we already did a deck tech on Daxos, Blessed by the Sun. Whenever another creature we control enters the battlefield or dies, we're going to gain 1 life. This can also be a good blocker with the devotion of 2 white. It's only 2 converted mana costs, so you can get this card out really easily. And this is really good for a small creature and token deck. In decks like this, you want to run cards like Martial Coup or White Sun Zenith just to summon a lot of tokens on the battlefield and trigger the effect. I would highly recommend running something like this Rhino. Whenever you gain life, you're going to gain twice that much life instead. So every time a creature enters the battlefield or dies, you gain 2 life, and when you pair it with these token generating machines, you're going to be able to generate a lot of life very quickly. Anafenza is pretty cool too because she's only 2 mana, and whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, we're going to bolster 1. So we get to choose a creature with the least toughness among creatures we control and put a +1 counter on it. I think this commander works well when paired with other creatures or spells that are going to generate some counters. So cards like Grateful Apparition, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we're going to proliferate, and the 2 other creatures are going to give other creatures we control some +1/+1 counters. When you pair this with cheap tokens or small creatures, and then if you give them counters, it just makes them even more powerful. Moving on to the next commander, we have Oswald. This supports more of an artifact build. For 1 white, we can tap this card and sacrifice an artifact. Then we can search our library for an artifact card with a mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrifice artifact's mana value. Then we can put onto the battlefield. We can essentially load our deck with artifacts, and then we can search them out with this card. So we can run things like Pithing Needle if we want to specifically shut down one of our opponent's cards. Then we can play something like Swiftfoot Boots, just to be able to give some creature hexproof or in haste. We can also play some bigger creatures to play later on in the game like Steel Hellkite. If you like playing white and you love artifacts, this is definitely the card for you. Being able to search for almost any artifact in your deck definitely makes this card useful. There's obviously many good multicolored cards, so we'll go over a few of them in this video. If you love zombies, then this is definitely the card for you. Whenever another zombie you control dies, if it didn't have decay, create a 2/2 zombie creature token with decay. It can't block, and when it attacks, sacrifice it at the end of the next combat. However, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a zombie, and if you do, you get to draw a card. This does fit very well for zombie tribal. However, you can also use it as a draw engine for your deck. It's pretty hard to pass up some free tokens and draw. With a deck like this, you're really going to want to run Gravecrawler. Easily one of the best zombies because you can continually sacrifice it and then recast it as long as you control another zombie. Undead Arger is going to allow you to draw some more cards whenever a zombie dies, and Diregraph Colossus will just get larger the more zombies that are in your graveyard. Whenever you cast a zombie spell, you're also going to be able to create even more tokens. This commander is definitely a really good budget option for zombie tribal. Next up we have Elena. For 4 mana, she's a 2/3 with flying, death touch, and lifelink. She's going to give all of the creatures with flying is going to get +1 power. Also, whenever we cast an artifact or enchantment, we're going to get a 1/1 token with flying. This creature will be a 2/1 with flying because of her secondary effect. This deck works super well with these cards, and I'll throw on the screen right now. Because if you cast something like Intangible Virtue, you're going to get a free 1/1 token. It's actually going to be a 2/1. Then it's going to be a 3/2 with Vigilance. Also, if you play something like the Thopperist, you're going to get even more tokens, and then you can sacrifice tokens to draw some cards. So this deck obviously wants to play enchantment and artifact spells. However, there's so many cheap cards out there that can buff up your tokens. Definitely a good commander if you like playing with tokens as well as artifacts and enchantments. Ishin's ability is if a creature attacking causes a trigger ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers one additional time. They use trigger 3 times in that one sentence. Each combat you're going to be getting a lot of value if you play things like Krenko, the Maw of Flames, or even Inferno Titan. Because let's say the Maw of Flames attacks, right? You're going to deal 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to each of the 2 other targets. That effect is going to trigger again. So this deck you're obviously going to want to run things that when they attack, something happens, because you're going to get 2 times the benefit. There's definitely a lot of fun creatures you can run in the deck like this, so definitely continue researching. Roko is my type of commander. When it enters the battlefield, we're going to search our library for a creature card with mana value X and put it onto the battlefield. This is great because we can search out answers that we need to resolve problems. We can also cast it early in the game to get some mana ramping cards, or we can even go into something like Visitor of Remedies and then the Devoted Druid or whatever to go for some infinite combos. With a card like this as your commander, there's so many things you can do because essentially your whole entire deck is now searchable. Oscar the Reconstructor is good for some artifact decks too. Its first effect is okay, we're going to really talk about the secondary effect. For X, and then you can tap this card. You can exile an artifact with a converted mana cost of X from your graveyard. Then you're going to create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card. This is awesome because you fill up your graveyard with artifacts and create double the amount of artifacts with them. So if Combustible Earhulk is in your graveyard, and then you pay 6 and tap this card and exile that, you're going to get 2 triggers with Combustible Gearhulk as well as a 6/6 body on the field for only 6 mana. I would also recommend running this Planeswalker and the Goblin Engineer to search for artifacts and add them to your hand. Definitely good for artifact strategies. There's definitely so many other budget commanders obviously to add, but I can't do it all into one video, so we'll definitely be doing more videos soon. Let me know some of your favorite budget commanders that I missed. Maybe I'll add them to the next video. Thanks for watching everybody, hope you enjoyed, take care.